Okay, so now in the next 30 to 40 minutes, some extrapolation of the thoughts. Dr. Agus, I would like to start with you. Your message, a message of rationality, a message of knowledge, a message of optimism. You know that anything that man invented, man researched during his times, eventually he used it also for the worst. Are there not some, if not more than that, dangers in the message of the end of illness, of the knowledge that we'll know more about ourselves, perhaps Big Brother, United States government, Facebook, who have you, will know everything on us? Where do we go from here?
What are you hiding?
You know what? I'm not sure, and I'll ask Professor Gilbert about it next. Perhaps we do not want to know what's inside our genes, that we don't want to know what's lurking there.
What's the greatest thing in the world to happen to stem cells? It was George Bush. Because George Bush banned research, federal funding of research on stem cells. Everybody on the streets of Tel Aviv, New York, LA knows what a stem cell is. So with discourse brings understanding. When Mayor Bloomberg of New York City said trans fats weren't good and started to ban them in restaurants, people argued, is a nanny state good, is a nanny state bad? But nobody said trans fats were good for you. And what happened is, someone in New York City, if they go anywhere in the country and shop, they shop differently. So I believe information is good and discourse is good. At the same time, knowing yourself is the only way we're actually going to improve healthcare and have responsibility in healthcare. We all have a right to do whatever we want. You have a right to smoke, to drink soda, to sit all day. But the question is, does society have the obligation to pay for the healthcare ramifications of your behavior? And my answer is emphatically no. My answer is that each of us are in charge of ourselves. Technology is giving us a window, and it's giving us a window to be able to look at ourselves and understand the conversation in our body. We have every right to look. We have every obligation to look, because we need to be there for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren.
And I want to continue with you, Dr. Agus. You mentioned, and of course you can't avoid the question of healthcare. It is, after all, not only a technological question, not only scientific, not only even personal, it's political, it's economic question, and then you have various fields contradicting your own vision.
Listen, in the United States, healthcare and food are 31% of our economy. Yet in the recent election, the State of the Union, nobody mentioned either. They talk about healthcare finance, but they actually don't talk about healthcare. Israel, it's 25% of the economy is food and health. Yet all I see is discussions of the finance of Kupat Cholim. We need to start to take responsibility and have those conversations, and they need to be out in the open. You have no qualms about going online and doing your banking. We all need to take our healthcare information, whether it be your genetics or otherwise, and start to contribute it so that we can be part of the cure for diseases for our children and grandchildren. It's our obligation to the next generation.
Professor... Yes, that's right. Professor Gilbert, I want to continue with you, and you won't escape so subtly. We will return to the question of happiness later. But still, the brain. For what, 100,000, perhaps 1 million years, we've been gatherers, hunters, farmers at most. In the last century, we are psychologists and economists and foreign news editors and what have you. Do our brains bring us there? Can we be in these surroundings? Are we better equipped to deal with new and changing so rapidly environment?
Well, there's no doubt that we are navigating a very new ocean with a very ancient vessel, a vessel that was not designed for this environment. We are made to make very good decisions about whether to hide, about whether to jump, about whether to hit or kick or punch. We're not made to make decisions about whether a nuclear reactor is particularly liable to the effects of a tsunami or whether we should buy long-term healthcare insurance. So it's true that we are the victims of a machine that was made for another time. But there's hope, because part of our brain, a part that we share in small proportion with other mammals, but that is much larger in human beings than any other, this frontal lobe, is the part that's capable of rational thought. And it's the part that allows us to do something that no other animals can. I mean, I look out everywhere I travel. I come to Jerusalem and I see a hotbed of civil rest. I mean, really, what I see are mainly millions of human beings getting along quite nicely. This is remarkable. There's no other animal that can do something like this unless they're genetically related. We're the only animal that can live in peace with people who share none of our genes. This is a miracle, and it's due to this part of our brain. So look, there's always a war going on inside us. It's the war, the call of the ancient brain and the knowledge of the wise brain. There's no reason to believe that we can't resolve these difficulties in favor of the latter rather than the former.
Okay, you two were too optimistic for my thoughts. We'll have to go to Mrs. Hirsi Ali. These two fine gentlemen talking in the name, and I agree with them up to a point, of science, technology, rationality, everything is fine. But today, the day that we are here, Boko Haram, Islamic militia in Nigeria, murdered several children because they learned to their final year exams, because they learned Western thoughts, Western sciences. So who is winning in this war?
Well, that I think is the point. Both gentlemen, whom I admire very, very much, children of an open society where there is democracy and the rule of law and enough stability to do long-term research financed by the government or financed by philanthropists. Most of the world is not like that. There are closed societies, there are anarchic societies, there are children who are born today in places where they won't make it to age 5, let alone worry about the future of the planet. So I think generally I'm optimistic in the sense of what mankind, womankind has has attained, and the spread of that, the spread of all these goods, political freedoms, economic freedoms, scientific and technological development, as human beings in general, we have really achieved a lot. But there are still those pockets of ignorance, of fanaticism.
Only pockets? No more than that?
Well, unfortunately, on a world scale, the number of people who are affected by terrorism, by ignorance, by disease, just in numbers, are more than those who are not. So in that sense, on a world level, that's quite bad. But compare it to things to 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and that again, I think, is something that really makes me optimistic and believe that all of these things, we will be able to put it past us. If at the same time we're able, through technology or otherwise, not to develop machines that can completely destroy us and the planet.
And continuing on this thought, and I totally agree with you about the human spirit, when you hear and see a story like Malala Yousafzai, the 15-year-old Pakistani girl who was almost brutally murdered by Taliban because she wanted education for girls in her home country. Are you more optimistic because of her spirits, because of her courage, or more despaired because of the forces against her that the United States, by the way, are entering peace talks with today, the Taliban?
I'm optimistic because of her. I'm inspired by women like Malala, and it's the reason why I get out of bed. And I think, and that is what I meant by at the end of my talk when I said there are individuals here who are really sincere about achieving peace and democracy and the rule of law. They are fragmented, they are weak, they're disorganized, but they are there. And the art now is to find them, organize them, guidance, resources, and so on. So there are thousands of Malalais. And the idea is for us to stand up and resist and know that resisting the dark forces, whether they're the Taliban or not, that they will fight in return, and that it's not going to be a breeze to get to a peaceful society where women are emancipated, but definitely inspiring and definitely energizing.
And Dr. Agos, I want to return to you on the question of illness or illnesses.
I'm against it, by the way.
I want to ask you about it. Are we prepared to live longer, not 10 or 15 years? Are we prepared, can we live for 200, 300? Some people predict it. Ray Kurzweil and others say, okay, in the near future, the interface of man-machine, of nanobots in our bloodstream, what have you, will be there. But do we want a planet of 6 or 7 billion senile people?
Well, I think the answer is right in front of us with President Perez.
He's a youngster, and not everybody is President Perez, as you know well.
Listen, right now, in the current human condition, there's general engineering failure in the 10th decade at 100 years old. Our body wasn't engineered, our bones, our blood vessels, etc. Stem cells have the potential for making change there, and I think we will. But the key is, thinking forward. Our society, as Professor Gilbert alluded to, is so good about thinking about today, but not about tomorrow. And I think if we really, as a society, started to have a metric for health. Problem with health is I have no blood test for it. So if I tell a 20-year-old, I want you to get healthy, how do they know what to do? If I tell them to eat well, it's not going to affect them for 20, 30, or 40 years. You can't get them to do that because there's no way of looking to it. It was like Professor Gilbert growing bald, no offense. It just happens over time. So we need to start to develop ways of measuring things. And then I think we can actually go longer. And remember, it's a value system-based decision with all of us. I do think we want to live longer. I think we want to live better. And at the same time, we want that quality of life. And so I believe we can actually achieve it. I believe President Perez has the potential of going decades.
Okay, and I want to continue.
He better.
Yeah.
We need him.
And Professor Gilbert, and I'll return to you, Dr. Agos, on these thoughts about living longer, about being healthier, and about being happy. We are there, the happiness. When I hear about somebody talking about how happy he is, I'm getting worried. I'm against happiness. When I think about happiness, I think about 1984. Winston Smith, he loves the big brother at the end of the book. He's happy. I'm thinking about Brave New World. I'm thinking about, you know what? The fundamentalist who's happy in his religion, in his fundamentalist religion, he is far happier than me and perhaps you. Where is do we need to be happy or just to look for happiness?
Well, I think the word happy obviously has a frivolous and cheap meaning, and it's very easy to say, happy, who wants to walk around stupid with a big smile? Maybe some of us do. But the important thing to note is that, first of all, I agree with a nice Jewish philosopher named Spinoza, who said that everything all men do is in service of happiness, and he probably meant women too. Everything we do is in the service of our happiness. This is the reason we eat chocolate, but it's also the reason we take care of our children. If you look at the kinds of things that make human beings happy, they tend not to be frivolous and silly. They tend to be the very things that societies value. People are happy when they have good physical health. People are happy when they have security and peace. People are happy when they have good relationships with family and friends. There's no mystery about the things that make us happy, but really they're not frivolous. If you said to me, imagine a world in which everybody's happy, I'm imagining a world at peace, because a world in which there's war is not a world in which everybody's happy. If you say, would it really be a good world if everybody walked around with a big smile, I say, yes, because that's clearly a world in which everyone has enough to eat. So you're not going to convince me that happiness is a silly thing we shouldn't care about. I do think it's the end-all of all of our endeavors and pursuits.
Obviously it is, but every individual seeks happiness. Sure, but let's go 20, 25 years ago. Fred Fukuyama writes about the end of history. We, the West, the rational West, we won. We beat the ultra-religious, we beat communism and Nazism and fascism, and we can close shop and go home. History has ended. That was 2 years before 9/11. Now, many societies in the world will not accept your point of view of rationalism. To some societies, bliss is eternal war, not eternal peace.
I don't believe that for a moment. I think people who wage war generally would like that war to end. They would like it to end in their favor. So I don't believe there are societies that are hell-bent on always having eternal war. I didn't write the end of history. It's an unfortunate phrase, but I shouldn't be held responsible for the fact that history, in fact, didn't end. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think you've been asking several of us, imagine you're on a journey. Which is true? You've come a long way, or there's a long way to go? Well, both are true. We've made a great deal of progress in the last 100 years, in the last 300 years. There's still a long way to go. I don't think we have to choose between these two things.
Mrs. Hirsi Ali, in the last 2.5 years, we've seen this tsunami in the Middle East. We've seen this great turmoil, and we're in the middle of it. We don't see the end yet. What we know for sure is that dictators, but secular dictators, Western-leaning dictators, were fallen, have been, and what came instead of is not democracies, in some cases perhaps, war in Syria and the Muslim Brothers. And the position of women especially has been worsened.
Yes. I read about the Arab Spring, or the revolts and the uprisings in the Arab world, and I was heartened by it. I thought it was a good thing that the young Arab populations were demanding basic rights of freedom, economic freedom and political freedom, and the end of corruption. Now, to get to that tomorrow, would the path be easy? No, I didn't think that it was going to be easy at all. In some cases, it was quite clear it could be civil war or anarchy or a new military dictator. In most cases, it was also clear, if you followed this region, that the only organized movement was the Muslim Brotherhood, and that they would come to power. On the short term, take Egypt for instance, things will go bad for Egypt because the Muslim Brotherhood will come to power and consolidate their power. On the long term, however, I see for Egyptians and Tunisians and other societies that elect a Muslim Brotherhood type government, I see a somewhat brighter future, because they'll be tested in government, not as an opposition, but in government. And the government implemented on the principles of Sharia is ultimately not going to be what the people who deposed of Mubarak really want. We see that in Iran. We see everywhere where Sharia is implemented, human rights are violated, women's rights are violated, the economies are very poor. I mean, not the one item oil economies, but most of them are violated. So once they've had this test, the next wave of protests we're going to see is a wave of protest against Sharia law, and hopefully a demand to separate religion from politics once and for all.
And you mentioned the word religion. In your view, what we see, and perhaps not only in Islam, is the problem how we interpret the religion or the religion itself?
I don't want to make any comment on religion. I just want to make a comment on mixing religion and politics in the way that I used to be a politician. For a candidate or a party that is seeking the power to govern, to ally oneself with God. Look, you can have an opposition against man, but you can't have an opposition against God. And those people running in the name of God are very arrogant. They put themselves in God's place. I can't think of anything more arrogant, and it's only a matter of time before many Arabs and Muslims will discover that when you elect the Muslim Brotherhood, you get Mohammed Morsi, you don't get Almighty Allah.
Dr. Agus, I want to return in these broad terms. You speak, and all of us, in Western thought. Western values and Western-funded science and money. How long will it take for, let's say, stem cell research to arrive to the darkest corners on the face of the earth? And I'm not talking about Africa or perhaps the Islamic world. In Russia, the longevity of men today is 60 years and falling. And perhaps this is not, if you want to talk about better health, the entire world around, perhaps not the avant-garde of science. Perhaps we need to go to purification of water, to the things that Bill and Melinda Gates fund doing in Africa, fighting malaria. There is the real battle, or the main one.
Listen, in the last decade, what we've seen in the lesser developed world is a dramatic rise in non-communicable diseases, cancer, heart disease, diabetes. There are countries in Africa today where more people die of cancer than HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. Half of them, by the way, are from cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is a preventable disease. We have a vaccine. Yet in the United States, only 6% of boys and 30% of girls who should get that vaccine actually get the vaccine. And it's a frozen vaccine. You can't use a frozen vaccine in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think we need to sit down and say, where are the best uses of our dollars and our resources going forward? And it's going to be in a couple of areas. It's going to be in disease prevention. We have the ability and the technology of preventing most diseases, or at least delaying them. Remember, there's a pill a day that if you take it, it's a 2,000-year-old pill that if you take it, reduces not the incidence, but the death rate of cancer by 37%, heart disease by 22%, and stroke by 17%. This pill is called a baby aspirin. We need to look on that side of prevention. And the second area is going to be food. Is that historically, we've used technology to make food so it grows and doesn't get disrupted by climate changes and its insects and pests, etc. We need to start to optimize food around health. Food is what we all do every day. You start to combine prevention and food, and we're going to have a dramatic effect, not just in developed countries, but in lesser developed countries also.
Professor Gilbert, you showed us before the human brain. Now, the human brain, you take it and you don't know if the man is Chinese or American, Israeli, Arab, Indian, what have you. But in this universal message of the things that makes us, as you said now, all of us want peace, all of us wants to be happy, etc. You don't take into account cultural phenomena that perhaps the boy growing up in Rwanda and in the United States, in Japan and in Africa, in Israel, and perhaps 100 meters from him in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, thinks differently, is capable for totally other things, seeks his happiness differently?
Well, of course, not only are there differences between nations, there's differences within a city block on how people think and how they feel. Human differences are delicious and interesting, but almost all of us fall victim to the illusion that they're large. If you were a Martian and you looked down with some magnificent instrument and you knew everything there was to know about the heart and mind of a single man, you would know 90% of what you need to know about all the other human beings on Earth. We think we are remarkably different from each other because we are in the business of looking for differences. I want to know who should be my wife and who not, who should be my friend, who not, and so I exaggerate the differences between people. This is what the human mind does. But we can't lose sight of the fact that what we have in common, because we have all the same machinery, is much larger than the things that separate us. Cultural differences are interesting, they're interesting to study, they're interesting to participate in, but they shouldn't obscure the fact that we're one species separated by very artificial barriers that come and go.
So you do not accept, for example, the theory of Samuel Huntington about clash of civilizations, that the American way of thinking, that eternal optimism, the city on the hill, is different from, let's say, a Confucian thinking, ultra-Orthodox Islamic thinking, or even feeling, etc.?
No, you'd have to be crazy to say there's no difference. Of course there's a difference. The very fact that you can describe them with different words proves they're a difference. The only question is, are these differences profound? I don't think so. I think different cultures show us the different ways in which the same brain can achieve different outcomes. You know, you raise a child in America, you raise a child in Iran, those children will have a lot in common and some differences. The differences are an example of the power of socialization. The human brain's most remarkable attribute is its adaptability. You know, unlike most animals, we come with our brain not fully developed. We're born prematurely compared to all the other mammals. And there's a reason for it. It's not just because our heads are so big that we would kill our mothers if we stayed in the womb for 2 years. It's also because if the brain is born immature, it gets to ripen and grow in the very society in which it's going to function. So the human brain is capable of adapting to almost any form of social organization. So yes, we're different. Those differences are wonderful because they provide hope that all of us can achieve the best things we see on our planet and avoid achieving the worst.
Mrs. Hirsi-Alti, this subject of a clash of civilizations, recently I've read a marvelous book, Civilization. I presume you know it very well. It was written by Niall Ferguson, Mrs. Hirsi-Alti's husband. And it's called not only Civilization, but Civilization, the West and the Rest. What is it about Western thinking? How come that if you look at the world 500 years ago, there's the mighty Chinese Empire and the Indian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and some small, almost non-existent countries in the back of Europe, Portugal, 1.5 million people, Netherlands, less than 1 million, England, 4 million, came to rule the world. Why is it that all the explorers of the world from that point onwards were European or Europe's children, so to speak, American, Russian, etc., etc.? Has Islam, China, and the rest frozen, or did the West did some leap thinking, leapt forward, and because of what? What made it what it is?
I think you would need an entire library to explain those differences. I will stick to one, I'll try and say it in one word. I think at a certain point, Western culture encouraged the process of trial and error. I was born in a Muslim household in the Muslim world. It's a culture of shame and honor, and if you make a mistake, you are shamed. I just came from China, and it's a culture where still to this day, it's very difficult to make a mistake. When I'm in the US, when I was in the Netherlands, making mistakes is almost encouraged. And if we can't fail, then we can't succeed. And I think a culture that nourishes experimentation is a culture that will outgrow the others. The danger now in our education systems is that that is under pressure. And as long as we keep trying and failing, we'll be on top of the world.
Dr. Agus, so what will it be, the thing that will bring us to the better future? The thing that Mrs. Hirsi-Alti talked about in the word curiosity, the looking forward to what's next and trying to solve that problem?
John Kennedy, our former president, said, we're going to put a man on the moon. And if you read the op-ed in the New York Times that week, it said he was crazy. In fact, the uniform sentiment was negative. Well, 9 years later, Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. What was the average age in Missile Command when Armstrong stepped on the moon? It was 27, which means the kids were 18 years old when he made his proclamation. So the change in healthcare is not going to be me. It's not going to be the scientists of my generation. It's going to be the next generation. And my only hope is that the education system catches up and changes. Right now, our education system is blocks. You have physics, biology, chemistry, and there are these silos. We need to pull the disciplines together. This needs to be the decade of convergence. And with this convergence, I truly believe we're going to make a marked advance in what we're doing, whether it be in health or in other areas. But we need to get the kids excited about it. We have no role models in healthcare. If I asked you today who leads healthcare whether it be in Israel, in EU, or in the United States, we would never get the same answer among 10 different people. We need to develop leaders, because with leadership brings the ability of kids to be aspirational and to go into that field, and that's needed.
Professor Gilbert, a scientist was someone to look onto. He was the man who will lead us to the better future, and most of you do that. If you pay attention recently in movies, in culture, in popular culture, in TVs, the scientist is the one who opens the Pandora box that brings destruction on the face of the earth through hubris, or perhaps through, I don't know, some theories, or just neglect, or whatever. Are we, the people, the gap between science and us is growing so much that we are afraid of science, afraid of the thing that it can lead us there, and says, okay, we do not want that, we don't know where we are going?
You know, when I was young, my father is a professor of microbiology, molecular biology, excuse me, and when I was young, he sat the 3 children down on the couch and he said, you know, your mother and I only want one thing for you in your lives. We want you to be happy. You can make any choice you like as long as you're happy. You can be a professor of anything you want. And so, you know, in my family, we didn't believe in the Pandora's box. We didn't believe. My father was not a religious man, but he told me the basic Jewish value is knowledge. And knowledge can be used for good or it can be used for evil, but it is never in itself good or evil. And so I guess I continue to believe that. You know, we ask scientists, physical scientists, engineers, biologists, to solve problems for us. But if you look around the world, from my point of view, almost all of the problems that plague us are behavioral problems. They're things that we do wrong. And if you ask what it is that separates the people who behave well from the people who behave badly, there are many answers, but one looms largest, and it's education. It's knowledge. If there's a single thing that we can do to get rid of the stereotype about the scientist, to bring about the kinds of miraculous changes that my colleague here talks about, or the political changes that my friend here talks about, it is certainly education. It's the magic bullet.
Totally agreed. And Mrs. Hirsi Ali, when you look at the world, and you've been through so many turmoils in your life, and traveled the world, are you an optimist?
Am I an optimist?
Yes.
Am I an optimist? Yes, I am an optimist.
You think that we are going in better places in the entire civilization or civilizations that we see about?
I have concerns. I have concerns, for instance, about the future of nuclear technology, the environment, stuff like that. But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because, and I base my optimism on, again, what humanity has achieved in the last 200 years alone. Things will be had. Let me call myself an optimistic realist. I'm not a utopian.
Our time is up.
Yeah, the future will not be perfect, but it will be better.
Okay. Our time is up, and I want to end and to part with a personal thought. Let's say someone would have asked me on a terrible day, to me personally and to the State of Israel, the 6th of October, 1973. Mr. Nahari, and I want to assure you, my NCOs in the army didn't speak to me that nicely at the time. 20 years from now, which country will survive and which not? Israel, who at that very moment was fighting for its life. I want to remind you, the Syrians are on the fences. Day later, famed General Dayan will speak about the destruction of the Third Temple. Or the Soviet Union, 22 million square kilometers, 300 million people, all the minerals on the face of the earth, the nuclear submarines, nuclear bombers. The red flag brings, if not joy, at least awe in half the world. Who would have thought that dictatorships will fall over the rest of the world? And yes, the fall of dictator does not guarantee that democracy will follow, or even a better dictator. Who could have predicted that 20 years after the Yom Kippur War, Israel will thrive and the Soviet Union will collapse? will disappear, just like that. That million people, million Jews and their families will come here because here is better than that. So let us remember, as a comforting parting thought, that although the paradise promised by some hasn't arrived yet, the apocalypse promised by many more didn't come either. Total nuclear war, collapse of society, the big brother, well, this has arrived, but on television, not in reality. And the full-scale hunger and global jihad, this did not happen, didn't materialize. We do not live in the best of possible worlds, but neither the worst, as some will have you believe. And yes, we can still shape the future, make it better for us and for our children. I want to thank very much Dr. David Agus, Professor Dan Gilbert, Mrs. Ayan Hirsi Ali. Thank you all for attending. Have a nice day.